Okay, today we are going to talk about how power creep in gacha games is not only not a problem, but it's actually a solution to 3 different problems that show up over time with these games. So we're also going to talk about how to determine if the power creep is actually imbalanced to the point of being pay to win or predatory. Now, the 3 problems are your long-term gameplay motivation, character potential, and new player potential. And a well-balanced power progression system or power creep, it's the solution to problems that arise in these areas as a live service RPG continues throughout its lifespan. So, the main issue is that RPGs are not like action games like Metal Gear Solid or Resident Evil, or fighting games like Street Fighter or Tekken, or MOBAs even, like, where the characters are static and they're exactly as capable when you face your first enemy as they are when you face the last. See, RPGs are entirely about power progression and power creep. That's the main mechanisms of the game and the general purpose for playing the game. You acquire resources, use those resources to become stronger, to take on increasingly difficult challenges. From Zelda to Elden Ring, Path of Exile, World of Warcraft to Wuthering Waves, it's the core system and the main motivation in playing. Like, many games are possible without using your resources, but this is known to be a player handicap used for challenges. It's not the main balance of the game. So if you've noticed that your favorite gacha RPG has HP inflation or some other difficulty inflation and generational power creep in its characters, all you've noticed is that it's indeed an RPG in the first place. Alone, those markers do not tell you if the game is pay to win. It's pay to win if the resources needed exceed the free-to-play resources provided. It's a very simple thing to tell, but you have to compare both. The entire point in playing the game is acquiring power through acquiring resources. All of the gameplay has resources behind it. That's the first of the 3 problems, your motivation. If you don't need more power, then you don't need more resources. And if you don't need more resources, then you literally have no reason to keep engaging with the gameplay. So just like the level 1 mob compared to the level 100 boss, the way you deal with the HP and difficulty inflation is by playing the game and then using your resources. If the game was never going to require more power than the level 1 mob needed, why would they even have so many ways to get more powerful? Like, why would they even have so many resources? So your difficulty inflation, it's the main driver of these games. So measuring it against progression is necessary. And for 2 of the big 4, at least, Zenless Zone Zero and Wuthering Waves, I really can't see how a player is unable to meet the power check while actually using their free-to-play resources. See, both games guarantee at least 1 limited character every other patch. And I think both games are currently still manageable with the starter cast. Like, some in extreme ways, like, soloing with 4 stars. So add a minimum of 5 limited characters to those accounts, and I think you'd have to try really, really hard to not be able to meet the DPS check. Like, I don't even think you could pick 5 characters from either game and not meet just the DPS check. You might need to add a skill check, but that's a whole different conversation. But just meeting the power potential, I can't see where you could pick 5 characters. And in both games, I can think of 2 that you can add and pretty much clear everything. But you can absolutely keep up with the difficulty inflation just by using your free-to-play resources in these 2 games. Now, another thing that people are noticing is the spikes in difficulty, but that's also necessary. See, because in these games, your mechanisms, it's two different things that are staggered but balanced, right? It's your power generation and your difficulty generation. And I'm going to go into more detail about what those are, what I mean by those at least, later, but basically it's just the amount of power you can acquire against the amount of power you need. And the reason these 2 things have to be kind of staggered, especially over time, is because it creates a satisfying game loop. See, you'll notice that at the start of any RPG, you feel a little bit weak and oppressed. You see a lot of dangerous areas that you can't even realistically access because of being too weak. And that feeling of being overpowered makes you resource hungry in the first place. It's literally your motivation to play. And after a while, you should start to feel overpowered for your currently available challenges. And then you find a new area and all of a sudden you feel weak and oppressed again. And it's that rotation between, being under and overpowered. That's the loop that keeps players playing for a long period of time. Like, even in static games, you'll see players impose handicaps on themselves to create the same loop. Oh, can I do it without using certain stronger weapons? Can I do it with knives only? Can I do it faster in the first place? Or, without using healing items? All of these different challenges They feel overwhelming at first. They make you feel underpowered, and then you overcome it. It's just kind of a basic gaming concept. Challenge and then dominance. Challenge and dominance. That's what makes it fun. So it's got to cycle back and forth between those two. Now, if those two generations are in sync with each other, there is no loop. The game just feels exactly the same every time you play. The enemy just dies in 3 hits. The numbers on the screen will go up, but the way the game feels to play, it stays exactly the same. And I think Diablo 4 actually had this problem early on, from what I heard, as they kind of synchronized their difficulty progression with the power progression. And I remember people complaining about how boring it felt. I didn't play, but I just remember that being a common complaint, that you just got stronger, but the game just felt the same all the time. So now, even worse than synchronized progression, though, is no difficulty progression at all. Obviously, the players would just keep becoming more and more overpowered until they just breathe and everything dies. And that would just be like returning to the starting area with an endgame character. It's clearly boring. So the difficulty progression is a necessary driver of the game. We just need to be sure if it's balanced or not. And one example of it being horribly unbalanced, at least in my opinion or my experience, was Honkai Impact 3rd. See, because in my time playing that game, and it was my first gacha game, I think, or at least definitely was my first action gacha. Yeah, there were guides that consistently pointed out, free-to-play builds that could meet the power check. The problem was that the rates of farming those loadouts were so much slower than the difficulty progression that by the time you finished a team, that game was 3 or 4 power levels higher. I farmed so many things in that game that were obsolete by the time I was finished. And I was playing obsessively. It was, your first gacha. I'm logging in twice a day. I'm doing every event. That game is the reason I literally don't do any events in gachas anymore. I haven't done like a single one in Genshin. I skip most of them because it's like trauma. I literally would rather go to work than do most of these events because it's not what I installed the game for in the first place. And it takes about 1 hour at a minimum wage job to replace like an entire patch of picking cabbages in a stupid minigame. God, I hated those stupid minigames. None of these stupid events are even why you install the game. It can't even be considered playing the game if it's not the game I installed to play, if it's just some other random game that I would never install. But I digress. I will rant some other time about the ridiculous mindset of free-to-play where they literally do the company taxes for 10 gems and take pride in it as if that means being a gamer. But like I said, that's another day. But yes, that's the easy way to see if the game's pay to win. Your resource generation is just too slow to keep up with the difficulty check without spending. And it's really not a problem in ZZZ or WoW. If you're trying to clear without using limited resources, that's a unique handicap challenge that's not the generic free-to-play experience or the balance. Not needing any resources at all would kind of just defeat the point of a live service RPG in the first place. So let's move on to the second problem, the viability of new characters and how your power creep systems enable this system, or at least save it, right? Because people seem to think that your difficulty inflation makes characters obsolete, and they're almost correct. Right? Again, in any RPG, the level 100 boss will make your level 1 gear obsolete. The point is to invest your resources to keep up. Now, often it seems that people are ignoring this system when they assume character obsolescence, because they compare it to the primary investment in a character. Now, if the game is balanced around the initial release of a 1.0 character, it would again similarly break the game. Let's use Jian and Wuthering Waves for an example. See, Jian is a first-generation Arrow DPS. And first, let me explain what I mean by generation and roster, because I'm going to refer to them for the rest of this video. A roster is just going to be the sum of what you need on an account to clear everything. It's like what you need to beat the game at any given time in the life cycle. Right? Now, your generation has 2 measurements. That's your power generation and your difficulty generation. The power generation it's a lot of things, but it's basically the amount of time that it takes you to fill the roster. It's generally going to be determined by like free-to-play resource rates. Now, your difficulty generation is basically how long the game stays at a given difficulty range. And those are the 2 things that I said. They're both moving along, but they kind of move in a staggered manner. And then for Wuthering Waves, like this is a first generation roster. You don't need all of these components. Obviously you can do it with a lot less, but this is just a good basic, low skill, surefire way to complete everything that the game has to offer. on a cyclical basis. So since this roster is full of first generation investments and it still works, this difficulty generation is still first gen, right? This is all your S0, R0, whatever. So this account has beaten the game. Now they're going to continue playing the game and they're going to get more resources. And those resources go into the next generation. There's no more spots to fill on the roster unless they just add a whole bunch of modes or complexity, which we really don't want, right? So now they just hyper invest in their roster for the rest of the time that they play the game, basically. And each time they do, it's going to bring it up to another power generation. And so that's why generational power creep is going to come into play. The hyper investment system is not just whale bait, it's what allows players to invest their next generation of free-to-play resources into the previous generation characters and bring them up to the current difficulty check, or even beyond it, right? Jian is likely only to become obsolete if you stop investing free-to-play resources into him. So yeah, the game expects you to keep playing, keep getting more resources, and keep using those resources on the characters and teams that you want to play. The difficulty will get higher, and your characters will get stronger, and that's that loop we keep talking about. Now, this power level represents investing in Jian's dupes, his weapon's dupes, his limited support, shorekeeper, her dupes, her weapons dupes. He doesn't even have a dedicated limited sub DPS support yet, so his team can get even stronger than this. He's not going to be obsolete anytime soon, not even close. I don't even think HSR has seen 1000% or 10x power creep yet. But the game expects you to spend your resources on the characters you want to play, and that's how you keep up with the game. Which leads directly to why the next generation characters power creep the previous. It's probably obvious now, but I'm still going to go through it. See, Jian was first generation. Cartethia, for example, is a second generation arrow DPS. You invested your first generation resources in Jian if you were playing, which is the goal of the company. They wanted you to be playing and keep playing. So they're going to design it around it working for you to be playing and keep playing. So you invested in Jian, and now you have a second generation of resources to hyper invest in your arrow team. You have two options. You can invest in Cartethia, or you can invest the same resources into Jian and make him stronger. So if Cartethia is only as strong as S0, R0, first generation Jian, she's just going to be a bad investment. You would get stronger, or you get more out of your investment by putting it back into Jian, getting his weapon, getting shorekeeper. And it's only going to get worse as the game progresses. Imagine having a free-to-play, max investment Jian, however many years down the road, because you just didn't like any of the other arrow DPS. And then finally, whatever generation that is, they release one that you like, but it's only as strong as S0, R0 first generation Jian. It would be impossible to put that new character on the roster, unless you want to spend gobs of money to hyper invest in them at that point. So the new generation has to power creep the previous generation to be at least as good as a hyper invested previous generation character at the time when they're released. For example, many people were complaining about Zani's power level, and they were saying, well, if Zani has her weapon, has Phoebe's weapon, she gains almost 50% more power than Zani alone. And it's like, of course she is. You're going from 160 pulls to 480 invested in one team. And Zani is already a second generation Spectro DPS, which means a first gen player could have put all 480 of those pulls into Jinxie, and they very likely would have her at S6 by then. That's the comparison you have to make. You can't just look at the numbers in a vacuum and then become terrified. So yes, generational power creep is almost necessary, or new characters would never represent an alternative to the old characters that are likely hyper invested by that point, or they could be hyper invested for the same cost of getting the new character. And that solves new players being able to onboard. See, as we described earlier, your basic system is you're going to have this loyal player that's been playing for a long time. They've been grinding resources potentially for years, and their accounts have just gotten stronger and stronger. The power check in the game has been progressing to motivate these long-term players. Your new players only have the current generation of resources and characters available to them. So the current gen characters have to instantly meet the current generation power check. Not only so it represents an option for the long-term players to switch, like we just discussed, but also It prevents new players from having to spend resources long-term players spent years acquiring, trying to bring the new character up to the current power generation. It's the way that both players can enjoy the current generation and play the game the way the devs want. They want new players to be able to jump in and basically keep up with the old players. So that's where the new characters have to account for the old investments. So there's the whole breakdown. You have your difficulty inflation, or your power progression. That's the motivation just for continuing to play the game in the first place. It's the need for resources. Your hyper investment systems allow those resources to be invested in whatever characters you want. And for the most part, it generally will keep them relevant. Now, you can measure that if they do it wrong. There's nothing that the player's resources can do to meet the power check. So they're like, okay, we actually messed up with this character, or we just changed the game and we have to adjust older characters to basically give them the boost that allows the player to then invest and keep them up in the game. And that's where you can see those two different things happening. But you have to take account all the different ways you can spend your resources before you just say, oh, this character is useless. It's like, well, if they're still level 1, of course they are. And then, of course, your generational power creep for characters makes your current generation characters a viable investment in comparison to highly invested previous generation characters. And this whole multitude of options makes the game accessible to a wide variety of players. It makes it challenging for long-term players, which is the goal, the game's goal for all players. It's reasonable for new players, and it actually makes it fair to players that quit for a while. And they return, they can just jump back in, play the game a little while, get the new characters, and be caught up to the game. It's kind of an ideal situation that without any of those elements would fall apart for one of the three player types, or one of the three situations at least. So power creep in itself isn't a bad omen. It's a staple of RPG mechanics, especially a live service RPG. It's where the value in continuing to play comes from. Zenless Zone Zero and Wuthering Waves seem to have very good resource systems that ensure you can keep up with difficulty inflation by investing your resources in a variety of different ways. Now, if they don't at some point, this system of measurement is going to be able to reveal that. It's going to be how you can tell, just like with Honkai Impact 3. You can literally just do the math. How long does it take to get this? How long before I need more? And it'll be obvious if it's actually pay to win, but you have to actually consider both. Much like any inflation rate, it has to be compared to another resource inflation rate to determine if life's getting better or worse. I want to talk about one other panic that I didn't mention earlier, which is the panic about tier 0. Because people seem to have this idea that it's this ripple effect of when they put the character at tier 0 or T0, the power ceiling, then that's how the game is going to be balanced. So your characters like Miyabi or Jinsei or Mavuika, that's going to be the entire game balance, and that misses the point of a tier list entirely. It implies that if the tier list exists, then there's a problem with the game. Now again, the developer wants to incentivize a wide variety of people to play the game. If you cater the game to one power level, you eliminate a lot of the people that have different appeals in the way that they play. See, to some people, they want to pull for a Danjin or a Soldier 11 more than a Miyabi or a Jinsei because they play for the struggle and they want to need the skill check in order to meet the power check. So it's a different appeal. You know, some may want to use a Miyabi-like character handicapped as a solo. I'm not really 100% sure that's still possible in ZZZ, but I think it is, right? So, thinking that the only value on the tier list is T0, where you cater the game to where your power floor and the power ceiling are the same tier, which is kind of what everyone seems to assume every time the power ceiling moves, that's also going to become the power floor. That would eliminate a lot of the audience. Like, there's just no intelligent reason to develop that way. That's why there's no need to panic every time a character hits or blows through the power ceiling. That character is going to appeal to a specific kind of player that wants easier progression or just playing for a different reason. But it's going to be a death sentence to a player that doesn't want to just breathe and have everything die. The entire power range, the entire tier list, should be considerably above the power check and wide enough to account for a large variety of players. That's how you actually measure it. If the power check is cutting off the tier list, then there's a problem. Also, sometimes your powerful characters are just lore accurate, so they kind of enhance the story. See, like Miyabi and Jinsei are supposed to be tiers above, like Mavuika I think also is. If they weren't any stronger than Anbi, Danjin, or Yoimiya, just so that players didn't have to be scared of power creep, it would kind of take away some of the impact from the story. The entire source of the problem just seems to be kind of a misunderstanding of how the system works. You know, HP inflation is not an independent marker of predatory or pay-to-win power creep. It's just a variable in the function. So hopefully this explanation is a bit of a relief, because you know, the games have a lot of actual issues and problems, but not everything is a valid complaint or worry. And it's just really important to distinguish those things, so our feedback, especially since, at least in the case of Zenless Zone Zero and Wuthering Waves, they clearly are listening. It's kind of really important to distinguish those things, that are problems and those things are actually just how the game works. And so you don't want to be distracted away from actual issues like the gear systems for things that are really just, again, the basics of how the game works in the first place. So, but what do you think? Am I crazy? Am I missing something else? I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.